The Stellar Defense Institute sprawled across Harmony Station like an architectural fever dream designed by committee, where 15 different species had somehow agreed on a building that satisfied absolutely no one, while managing to offend everyone equally. The station orbited a gas giant whose aurora displays provided what the tourism board generously called inspiring natural beauty, and what everyone else recognized as seizure-inducing light pollution that made reading impossible during daylight hours. Director Quinthara Velosian, whose species had transcended physical form roughly 3 millennia ago, but maintained corporeal bodies for bureaucratic convenience, surveyed the latest intake of cadets with a sort of philosophical resignation that comes from watching countless generations of young beings discover that the universe cared remarkably little for their personal theories about how things should work. The Ascended had long ago evolved beyond the messy business of physical conflict, preferring to resolve disputes through what they termed elevated discourse and what everyone else called talking problems to death until all parties surrendered from exhaustion. This made them ideal administrators and absolutely hopeless at understanding why the younger species insisted on maintaining military forces when clearly a strongly worded diplomatic communique could achieve the same results with considerably less property damage. The Institute represented the pinnacle of interspecies cooperation, a shining example of how advanced civilizations could work together to prepare their youth for careers in galactic peacekeeping. The reality, as with most institutions designed by idealists and administered by pragmatists, was considerably more complicated and significantly less inspiring than the promotional materials suggested. This year's crown jewel of diplomatic achievement had been securing human participation in the exchange program. The Sol system, having recently achieved faster-than-light capability through what appeared to be equal parts brilliant engineering and breathtaking recklessness, had been graciously invited to contribute to the Institute's mission of fostering interspecies understanding. The invitation had been extended with the sort of magnanimous condescension typically reserved for promising students from disadvantaged backgrounds, the galactic equivalent of an academic scholarship program for the culturally deprived. Humans, after all, represented everything that advanced civilizations had evolved beyond. They were violent, competitive, emotionally unstable, and disturbingly attached to solving problems through direct action rather than committee deliberation. Their homeworld qualified as what xenobiologists diplomatically termed a high-stress evolutionary environment, though privately most referred to it as that nightmarish death world where everything is trying to kill you, and somehow they developed space travel instead of going extinct like any sensible species would have done. Earth featured weather patterns that would be classified as natural disasters on civilized worlds, predators that had evolved specifically to hunt intelligent prey, and atmospheric conditions that required constant technological intervention to remain habitable. Yet humanity had somehow managed not only to survive but to thrive in these conditions, developing technology advanced enough to interest the galactic community, while remaining primitive enough to be non-threatening. They were perfect candidates for the Institute's diversity initiatives, exotic enough to be interesting, backward enough to be manageable, and sufficiently grateful for the opportunity to be properly educated by their betters. Maya Chen Rodriguez stood in the Institute's main concourse, observing the carefully choreographed chaos of Orientation Week with the sort of detached attention one might give to a particularly elaborate nature documentary. At average height for her species and built with the compact efficiency of someone who'd learned that form followed function rather than aesthetic preference, she possessed the remarkable ability to be simultaneously present and invisible in any gathering of beings too focused on establishing their own importance to notice as. The hegemony cadets dominated the central plaza with the casual arrogance of a species that had conquered half their galaxy before deciding that conquest was beneath their intellectual dignity. 7 feet of genetically perfected superiority. They moved through the crowd like apex predators who'd evolved past the need for actual hunting, but retained all the instincts for establishing dominance hierarchies. The collective representatives communicated through shared consciousness networks that made individual identity more of a philosophical concept than a practical reality. They regarded purely individual intelligence with the sort of patient amusement typically reserved for quaint historical curiosities, functional but charmingly limited in scope and efficiency. The warrior caste maintained the sort of rigid discipline that came from spending several millennia perfecting the art of honorable combat, their society having elevated warfare to such sophisticated levels that actual fighting had become an elaborate ceremonial dance performed by specialists while everyone else got on with more practical matters. And scattered throughout this collection of evolutionary achievements were the humans, represented by exactly 12 cadets who seemed determined to validate every preconception about primitive species by doing absolutely nothing to distinguish themselves from the background furniture. Maya had been assigned quarters with Rick's Telcor Maven, whose collective consciousness allowed her to experience the thoughts and emotions of roughly 4 billion other beings simultaneously while maintaining what she generously described as individual personality subroutines for social interaction purposes. The arrangement was part of the Institute's cultural integration protocols, designed to foster understanding between species through close personal contact and shared living experiences. In practice, this meant that Maya spent her evenings listening to Rick's Tell explain how individual consciousness was a fascinating but ultimately inefficient evolutionary dead end, while Rick's Tell spent her evenings trying to understand how Maya could function with access to only one perspective on any given situation. The first month passed with the grinding predictability that characterized educational institutions across the galaxy. Cadets attended lectures on interspecies diplomatic theory, participated in team-building exercises designed by beings who'd never actually had to build teams under pressure, and engaged in the ancient academic tradition of complaining about institutional policies while dutifully following them anyway. Maya Chen Rodriguez attended everything, participated when required, and maintained a sort of pleasant competence that allowed her to meet all requirements without exceeding any expectations. She asked questions that demonstrated appropriate curiosity without revealing any particular depth of knowledge, offered contributions that were helpful without being innovative, and generally conducted herself with the sort of steady reliability that marked her as a conscientious but unremarkable student. Her fellow cadets developed elaborate theories about human cognitive limitations. The hegemony representatives concluded that humans processed information too slowly for complex strategic thinking. The collective determined that individual consciousness was inherently inferior to networked intelligence for tactical applications. The warrior caste decided that humans lacked the spiritual discipline necessary for true martial excellence. Everyone agreed that humans were harmless, which was precisely the sort of unanimous consensus that should have worried anyone who'd been paying attention to how the universe typically responded to unanimous consensuses. Combat training took place in the Institute's Pride and Joy, a gravity manipulation chamber capable of simulating battlefield conditions ranging from the crushing depths of gas giant atmospheres to the bizarre physics of zero-gravity asteroid mining operations. The technology represented the collaborative genius of 12 different species, each contributing their particular expertise to create a training environment that could challenge cadets regardless of their evolutionary background or technological advantages. The chamber systems could adjust gravitational fields in real time, create atmospheric conditions ranging from methane storms to crystalline dust clouds, and generate holographic opponents sophisticated enough to adapt their tactics based on cadet performance. More importantly, it could do all this while maintaining the sort of absolute safety protocols that allowed young beings to learn from mistakes without experiencing the sort of permanent consequences that made their parents file diplomatic complaints. Week 6 brought advanced tactical scenarios, and with them the sort of competitive pressure that revealed character traits previously hidden beneath institutional courtesy. The hegemony cadets, accustomed to automatic deference from lesser species, began to chafe at training exercises designed to challenge their assumptions rather than validate their superiority. Zethkar Mulves represented everything the hegemony considered ideal in their youth: 8 feet of genetically optimized perfection, enhanced reflexes calibrated for tactical superiority, and the sort of natural charisma that made other beings instinctively acknowledge his leadership potential. His homeworld had eliminated the need for individual combat through overwhelming technological advantage, leaving their citizens free to develop sophisticated philosophical frameworks about the nature of strength, while their bodies remained impressive monuments to genetic engineering they'd never needed to actually use. The training scenarios, however, had been designed by the Ascended, who approached military strategy with the same methodical precision they applied to dimensional mathematics. They were less interested in allowing cadets to demonstrate their existing advantages, and more focused on forcing them to adapt to unexpected challenges, using whatever resources they actually possessed rather than whatever resources they thought they deserved. This meant that genetic optimization and technological superiority were considerably less useful than the ability to think creatively under pressure and adapt to changing circumstances using available tools rather than ideal ones. Maya Chen Rodriguez, meanwhile, continued her impression of someone who was working very hard to keep up with her more gifted classmates. She followed instructions competently but without flair, contributed to team exercises without assuming leadership roles, and maintained the sort of steady, unremarkable performance that allowed everyone else to feel appropriately superior while accomplishing mission objectives with minimal drama. The scenario that changed everything began as a routine boarding action simulation. Teams were required to infiltrate a hostile vessel, locate and secure sensitive intelligence, and extract under fire while dealing with damaged systems, hostile defenders, and the sort of time pressure that separated theoretical knowledge from practical competence. Standard military procedure, complicated by variable gravity, limited visibility, and the sort of unpredictable system failures that made textbook solutions considerably less useful than adaptive problem-solving skills. Zethkar's enhanced cognitive processing included improved spatial reasoning, accelerated tactical analysis, and the sort of natural leadership presence that made other beings instinctively defer to his strategic insights. All of which worked perfectly in controlled conditions against predictable opponents following known behavioral patterns. The simulation, however, specialized in providing none of these advantages. 43 minutes into the exercise, when his team had been assigned to work with a human contingent on a particularly complex extraction sequence, Zethkar found his patience with primitive tactical approaches reaching its genetically optimized limits. Maya Chen Rodriguez had been following his instructions with a sort of mechanical precision that suggested she understood the individual components of each task but lacked any appreciation for the elegant strategic framework that gave the meaning. She executed procedures competently, but without the sort of intuitive grasp of tactical principles that separated true warriors from mere followers of orders. "Your species approaches combat," he informed her during a brief tactical pause, his voice carrying the sort of educational patience typically reserved for explaining basic concepts to slow learners, with all the sophistication of a stone tool. Maya acknowledged this observation with a polite nod, which Zethkar interpreted as confirmation that humans were indeed capable of recognizing their own limitations, even if they lacked the intellectual capacity to transcend them. The simulation continued with the sort of escalating complexity that characterized military exercises designed by beings who'd never actually had to fight for their lives, but possessed extensive theoretical knowledge about what such experiences should involve. Teams navigated through damaged corridors, engaged holographic defenders with adaptive artificial intelligence, and dealt with the sort of cascading system failures that transformed straightforward tactical problems into exercises in creative crisis management. Zethkar's genetic enhancements performed exactly as designed, providing him with superior reflexes, enhanced strength, and improved cognitive processing that allowed him to analyze tactical situations with remarkable speed and accuracy. Unfortunately, the simulation seemed determined to present situations that required adaptation rather than optimization, creative problem-solving rather than superior execution of known solutions. The human, meanwhile, continued her methodical approach to each challenge with the sort of steady competence that suggested either remarkable adaptability or complete failure to recognize when situations had moved beyond the scope of standard procedures. The moment that redefined everyone's understanding of the nature of superiority occurred in Section Delta 7, a damaged engineering compartment where gravity fluctuated randomly between crushing acceleration and complete weightlessness every 90 seconds. The scenario required teams to traverse the section while maintaining formation and securing critical system components, a challenge that tested both individual competence and group coordination under constantly changing conditions. Zethkar had been growing increasingly frustrated with what he perceived as the human's inability to demonstrate appropriate appreciation for his tactical insights. She followed his instructions but without the sort of enthusiastic acknowledgement that his genetic optimization had conditioned him to expect from beings who recognized superior intellect when they encountered it. When she moved to secure a system component using a procedure that, while technically correct, failed to demonstrate proper deference to his more sophisticated tactical analysis, Zethkar made the sort of decision that revealed the difference between theoretical superiority and practical wisdom. He reached out to physically redirect her approach, not with malicious intent but with the sort of casual assumption of authority that came from a lifetime of being genetically designed to lead beings who naturally recognize their betters. What happened next occurred faster than the simulation's advanced recording systems could properly analyze. Zethkar's hand moved toward Maya's shoulder with a confident expectation that she would naturally defer to his guidance. Instead, his hand encountered empty space as she shifted position with a precision that suggested muscle memory rather than conscious decision-making. His forward momentum, calculated for redirecting a compliant target, carried him into a trajectory that his enhanced spatial reasoning couldn't quite process quickly enough to correct. Maya's response was so automatic that she later insisted she had no clear recollection of deciding to act. Her left hand intercepted Zethkar's extended arm at precisely the right angle to use his own motion against him. Her right hand found his center of gravity and applied exactly the amount of leverage necessary to convert his forward momentum into rotational energy around an axis that his genetic optimization hadn't prepared him to control. Zethkar, who had never experienced actual physical conflict and whose enhanced reflexes had been calibrated for situations where superior strength and speed provided automatic advantages, found himself describing a ballistic trajectory that his improved cognitive processing could analyze but not prevent. He impacted the deck plating with sufficient force to temporarily disrupt the gravity manipulation systems and create a sound that echoed through the chamber with a sort of finality that marked the end of one era and the beginning of another. The silence that followed possessed the quality of a fundamental shift in universal constants, the sort of profound quiet that occurs when everyone present simultaneously realizes that their basic assumptions about reality require immediate and comprehensive revision. Zethkar lay on the deck, his genetically optimized reflexes finally catching up to inform him that he was no longer vertical, while his enhanced cognitive processing struggled to reconcile what had occurred with everything his education had taught him about the proper relationship between evolved superiority and primitive capability. The other cadets observed the scene with the sort of fascinated attention typically reserved for natural disasters or quantum anomalies, events that were simultaneously impossible to ignore and difficult to process within existing frameworks of understanding. Maya Chen Rodriguez had already returned to her assigned task and was securing the system component with the same methodical competence she'd demonstrated throughout the exercise, as if depositing 8 feet of genetically perfect superiority on the deck plating was simply another routine procedure that required no particular comment or celebration. Combat instructor Vorden Kesthal, whose warrior caste training had taught him to appreciate efficiency in all its forms, reviewed the training recordings with the sort of professional interest that came from recognizing genuine skill regardless of its source or packaging. The recordings showed a textbook application of leverage and momentum that would have impressed instructors at the most prestigious martial academies in warrior caste space. What made it truly remarkable was not the technical execution, which was merely excellent, but the complete lack of conscious preparation or visible effort involved in its application. Maya Chen Rodriguez had responded to physical contact with a sort of automatic competence that suggested extensive training integrated so thoroughly into muscle memory that conscious thought was not only unnecessary but potentially counterproductive. The technique she'd used was sophisticated enough to work regardless of size differential, species variation, or gravitational conditions. More significantly, her response had been precisely calibrated to neutralize the threat without causing any damage beyond what was necessary to terminate the unwanted physical contact. This suggested not only technical skill, but the sort of tactical restraint that separated professional competence from amateur enthusiasm. The inquiry that followed was conducted with the sort of diplomatic delicacy typically reserved for preventing minor incidents from escalating into interstellar embarrassments. Representatives from the hegemony wanted explanations for how their genetically optimized representative had been defeated by a primitive species. The Sol Federation wanted assurances that their exchange program wouldn't be terminated due to misunderstandings about human capabilities. Everyone wanted to know what they'd been missing about human potential, and whether their assumptions about primitive species required fundamental revision. The answers, when they finally emerged through careful investigation and diplomatic information sharing, were both illuminating and profoundly disturbing to species that had evolved beyond the necessity of individual physical competence. Maya Chen Rodriguez was a third-generation product of a military family from Earth's North American continent, a region that had spent several centuries developing institutional knowledge about training individuals to remain effective in high-stress combat situations. Her grandmother had served in conflicts that required hand-to-hand combat skills. Her parents had been special forces operators, and she'd been trained from childhood in environments where physical competence was as fundamental as literacy. She'd learned combat techniques through repetition and practical application rather than theoretical study. Her reflexes developed through years of sparring with opponents who shared similar training backgrounds, and her skills refined through military service in situations where mistakes had consequences significantly more serious than academic disappointment. More importantly, she'd grown up on a world where environmental pressures had shaped human evolution toward practical competence in uncontrolled situations, where survival often required the ability to respond effectively to threats without advance warning or preparation time. Earth's evolutionary environment had produced a species that was optimized not for superiority in ideal conditions, but for effectiveness in chaotic ones, not for theoretical excellence, but for practical results under pressure. The revelation sent analytical ripples through the established galactic community. If humans, who appeared to be among the least impressive species in terms of obvious technological advancement, possessed this level of integrated combat capability, what did this suggest about the relationship between apparent primitiveness and actual competence? The hegemony's genetic optimization had produced individuals who were theoretically superior according to measurable criteria. Earth's evolutionary pressure had produced individuals who were practically effective according to survival requirements. The difference, it turned out, was considerably more significant than anyone had previously recognized. The collective updated their shared consciousness networks to include new probability matrices accounting for species whose capabilities might not be immediately apparent through standard evaluation procedures. The warrior caste began incorporating human training methodologies into their ceremonial combat curricula, curious about techniques that prioritized practical effectiveness over philosophical elegance. The ascended, with their characteristic intellectual honesty, acknowledged that their theories about the relationship between evolutionary advancement and military capability might require some fundamental revision. Zethkar Mulves found himself occupying the uniquely uncomfortable position of being the genetic pinnacle of his species, who'd been effortlessly defeated by someone his education had taught him to consider primitively inferior. His homeworld's philosophical frameworks had included extensive analysis of theoretical superiority, but remarkably little preparation for the possibility that practical competence might be more relevant than genetic optimization in actual conflict situations. The Institute's response was characteristically institutional. New protocols were established for interspecies training exercises, taking into account the possibility that some species might possess capabilities that weren't immediately obvious through conventional assessment methods. Cultural integration programs were expanded to include education about the diverse forms that military competence might take across different evolutionary backgrounds. The Human Exchange Program was quietly expanded, though official documentation carefully avoided any suggestion that this represented a change in the assessment of human military potential or strategic value. Maya Chen Rodriguez continued attending classes and participating in training exercises with the same unremarkable competence she'd demonstrated before the incident, though her fellow cadets now observed her with the sort of careful attention typically reserved for potentially dangerous equipment that appeared deceptively simple. Rick's Telcor Maven, whose collective consciousness had recorded and analyzed every aspect of the encounter from multiple perspectives simultaneously, developed new appreciation for individual intelligence systems that could operate effectively without network support or collaborative processing power. The Institute's training scenarios were gradually modified to include more unpredictable variables and chaotic elements, partially in response to the recognition that actual combat situations bore remarkably little resemblance to the controlled environments that had previously been considered adequate preparation for military careers. 3 months later, when Zethkar finally managed to overcome his genetic pride sufficiently to ask Maya how she'd learned to fight with such devastating efficiency, her response was characteristically human in its casual dismissal of what other species considered extraordinary. Older brother, younger sister, and about 15 years of mixed martial arts, she said, as if this explained everything that needed explaining. To her, it did. To the rest of the galactic community, it suggested that their assumptions about the relationship between technological advancement and personal capability might require considerably more extensive revision than anyone had initially anticipated. The Stellar Defense Institute continued its mission of preparing young beings for careers in interstellar peacekeeping, though with a significantly broader appreciation for the various forms that preparedness might take across different species and evolutionary backgrounds. The architectural fever dream of Harmony Station continued accommodating 15 different species in buildings designed to offend everyone equally. The Aurora displays continued providing seizure-inducing illumination during daylight hours. And Director Quinthara Velosian continued observing new generations of cadets with a philosophical resignation that came from watching the universe systematically demolish every assumption that civilized beings held about the nature of superiority and the proper order of things. The Institute's founding principles, inscribed in 15 languages across the main plaza, still proclaimed the advancement of interspecies cooperation through shared military excellence. The difference was that everyone now understood that excellence might manifest in forms they hadn't previously considered, from species they'd previously underestimated, and that the universe remained considerably more interesting and dangerous than any single species' evolutionary experience could adequately prepare them to handle. Which was, after all, exactly the sort of education that military institutions were supposed to provide, though rarely through such direct and memorable demonstration of the principles involved.